So I thought I would give a bit of an update on my 30 books in 30 days reading challenge. I was not successful. I read 20 books, or I completed 20 books, and I had a lot of longer books that were in various degrees of completion, but I did not finish them. Roughly halfway through. About 5 or 6 days before the end of June, I realized that I wasn't going to hit my deadline, so then I just pulled back on the reading a ton and just finished 20 books. I think I will post a link to my Instagram below where I have a picture of the 20 books I finished. The hardest book that I finished was probably Analects by Confucius. The easiest and shortest book is Managing Oneself by Peter Drucker, which, to be honest, so this book's like it's interesting, it's extremely short read. It's like 50 pages, and the pages are like this, where you have like barely any text per page, and so it's almost offensive that you would even bind this in a book to begin with, but here it is. So this was like the layup of the thing. And the longest book in terms of, I think, that I finished, in terms of words, overall words, it's not the longest in terms of pagination, I think would be Hitch 22, which is a memoir of Christopher Hitchens, who is a journalist that I liked a lot. He was a libertarian and at some points a Trotskyist, although that's like not as much what I like him for. He got most of the attention that he has gotten was as a result of like kind of the anti-theist movement that happened following the 9/11 attacks, where there was like a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment, and he was amongst those. Again, that's like not as much what I like him for, but that's probably what he's most famous for. His prose is incredible. I feel that he is quite incisive with his language, and well, this is starting to get into a review of Christopher Hitchens. Anyways, the longest book that I didn't finish, for example, is this collection of 100 essays, which is, I think, it's either 700 or 800 pages. It's 700 pages, and I got to, like, page 500. I did not finish this. And so I got quite a bit of reading done, but I didn't do the 30 that I wanted to. So to be, like, somewhat fair to myself, I suppose, there was a lot of ways that it like didn't go very well, or like was hard for some reason. Like there were 4 or 5 books that were really difficult books that I started reading, and then I was like, I don't want this to be one of the books, so I set them aside. One of them being like The Second Sex, which is like 800 pages, and I'd gotten like 50 pages into that before I was like, there's no way. A lot of it was also, I think this last June, I read more in that single month than I had in like maybe the past 14 months. I hadn't been doing a lot of reading in like the near past, and so this has been like an interesting like pick me up. I don't think there's like if I didn't have like a challenge for it, that I would have like read anywhere near this, so like that's kind of good. Another thing that was difficult was like I was also working out quite a bit and like maxing out on my lifts. And I think that both those, the reading a ton a day, like 10 hours a day, and working out and trying to max out, I think there was like a lot of interference. So generally speaking, when you are trying to lift a lot of weight, if there's stuff going badly in your life that causes stress, or just stress, it doesn't have to be bad, it's just stress, that makes it harder for you to lift heavy, because for your body, cortisol is kind of cortisol. It doesn't matter if you're getting it from like lifting or for trying to like concentrate really hard for an extended period of time. And so I think that both the attempts on the lifting portion as well as on the reading portion were affected, which is something to like keep in mind if you're like doing any sort of like challenge or attempt thing. Is like, if stuff's not going right like in your life, you should expect worse results in terms of your performance, or you should expect, like, if you think of your performance as like a distribution curve, right, where like most are like in the exact middle, and then towards the ends are like your good and bad performances, you should expect to see your bad performances when your life's like not going super well. or you're just stressed out a lot. And so there's that. Also, I've done this challenge twice before. I'd succeeded both of the previous times. I think I chose way harder books this time. And I think one of the previous times I didn't used to annotate. And if you're annotating, it obviously takes way longer to read. And also, I don't know if this is just because I wasn't used to reading or because I'm getting old, but my eyes hurt a lot with this one. So I read through 20 books, and about half of 10 books, the harder books. And I think maybe there's like some reflection to be had in terms of the style and approach for learning when you think of something like trying to read 30 books in 30 days. Because for the most part, I would not recommend doing this if your goal is to learn. Because I think the approach is bad because the retention is particularly bad. Or this is what I have found. When I'm reading this much, I don't have enough time to reflect on what I've read. And this reflection, I think, is important for retention. Reflection amongst other things. And so, even though I'm annotating and I'm like trying to break it up into manageable chunks so that like I can sleep between, I'm reading all the books simultaneously. That way, some of the books scaffold, so if you're reading them, it's important to not cover them and sleep in between, or this is what I found for myself. And so, reading 30 books in 30 days is gratuitous, in some sense, for some approach, because retention is bad. However, I think there's something to be said for like a brute force type of approach, where when you are looking for ideas, reading extensively is really strong, right? And then when you are trying to master the ideas, reading intensively is really strong. And I think that, ideally speaking, one should be able to oscillate between the two of these things, and perhaps just be willing to reread things once you've decided the idea is good. This is, I think, a bit of a trap for people who don't read a lot, perhaps, although that's like maybe a bit circular, is that there's a tendency to try and attack very difficult and complex books when you don't have like a lot of reading done, which in my mind is just it's better to try and run a bunch of hills and smaller books and smaller ideas and like just get in a ton of volume of books than it is to like climb the absolute mountain. And in particular, I'm thinking of philosophy, where there are some pretty abstract thinkers, and you have someone who like maybe reads 1 or 2 books a year, and for one of their books they decide to just take on like a massive thing of Hegel as just very difficult and dense philosophy. And you could just read like 5 books instead, and that are like about Hegel or around Hegel, and perhaps be more effective. And so like this intensive versus extensive type of dynamic comes up in a lot of things, as well as like in terms of like life. There's a book, Mastery, by Robert Greene, and as well as there's another one. It might be In Search of Excellence. I actually don't think it's In Search of Excellence. I forget the Talent is Overrated, maybe, where they're like 10,000 hour rule. You should pick a lane, stay in it, and just really master it, and just brutalize it. Maybe brutalize isn't the right word. And you can do this and get extremely good at something, but if you're just digging a trench, and never popping your head up to look at the other ways, maybe there's like some sort of mistake that's being made. And I think of this a lot of times in reading, where oftentimes, or just learning in general, if people completely stay in their own lane and don't sample stuff from other areas, like go for breadth, that they will start to miss out because at a certain point, just increasing reading, learning about one particular thing is like diminishing returns. And I think a good example of this is chess masters, like extremely strong chess players. The best way to get good at chess is obviously to some extent going to be studying chess, right? But there's going to be diminishing returns. And at a certain point, it's actually better to work out. And so almost all the top chess players work out. And the reason why is you have to be able to get enough blood to your brain in order to think, right? And so it's this thing where doing something that's way different than the task you actually want to be good at a certain point is better. And I think about this with like ideas because like if you are in a field that's like not into psychology, or for example, at a certain point, learning about cognitive biases is probably going to be better at sharpening your judgment in whatever field you're in than learning more about judgment in your particular field. And so, circling back to this like reading challenge thing, sometimes you just like want to be able to sample a wide swath of things and just read very quickly and not worry that you're not retaining it. And then sometimes you want to really read and master it. And I think that I get into like a sort of rhythm of just kind of treating every book the same. But I think that the ideal reading process would be one in which you can oscillate between this scavenging reading, where you are reading through something, just trying to find kernels of good ideas, and you're really not trying to master their entire point, and like intensive reading, where you are trying to really grasp what they're saying, and this might involve heavy rereading, annotating, mind mapping, reflecting, all these sorts of tools. But always doing these tools is maybe not the way to approach it, because you have to figure out which ideas are going to be the best to master before you start mastering them, I think. For an interesting book that is contrary to this 10,000 hour rule type of analysis, where people argue you specialize early and you just like crank at it, there is this book called Range by David Epstein, which is pretty interesting. And he puts forth the argument that when you gain, a lot of times the task that's required is not hyper specialization, but is instead synthesis of like two different fields, and you need to bring them together in order to make new and novel ideas or approach problems in a way that hasn't been approached before. I wish I could think of an example from the book, but it's been a while since I've read it. So just like a food for thought type of thing there. And so, to make a long kind of ramble about this extensive, intensive thing short, is I think that, as it relates to this reading challenge, I think that just trying to crank through a lot of books is a bad approach unless you are just sampling a bunch of different things. And that also, and I don't do this very well, being able to switch between reading something fast, where you're just trying to figure out if there are good ideas in it, and reading something intensively, trying to master it, is, I think, a skill that would be quite useful, and it's not one I have. I kind of just read books the same way, with one notable exception. There are psychology books where I can tell when they're introducing a particular study, especially the Milgram experiment or the Stanford prison experiment, and as soon as they start introducing that experiment, I just speed read it, because I've read through those experiments so many times that I know what's going to be said, and all I care about is what their takeaway as applied to their particular argument is. I actually think the American Psychological Association, in order to get like a certain stamp in books published in the United States, you actually need to discuss these two experiments, I think, because they're just like, you can't do them now because they would be considered crazy unethical, but they just show how much people are dramatically willing to conform to authority and like do heinous things. And like one of the reasons the Milgram did his experiment was because the experiment was the experimenter would tell them to like shock a subject who got a question wrong, and the shocks went up and up and up, eventually to like danger high voltage and like where it looked like it might kill them, and then it looked like they might have killed them. And the point for Milgram doing this experiment was he wanted to see how the Nazis, how the SS were like so heinous towards the Jews. And his idea was, I'm going to do it in the United States first, and make sure that we have a control to see what's wrong with these Germans. And then when he did it in the United States, like a ton of people went all the way with the shocks where they thought would have killed him. And it was just like shocking to anyone. Shocking. To everyone who thought that like only like 3%, I think, of Americans would go all the way to the top, and like 60% did. And it's like, wow, okay, well, we don't need to conduct this study in Germany anymore. Anyways, bit of a off topic. So yeah, the reading challenge went okay. I was actually pretty disappointed with myself, like a week ago, but then it's like, I don't know, probably shouldn't beat myself up over only reading 20 books. There's like this statistic that's like crazy to me, which is I think it's different for high school and college, but something like 25 to 40% of people, like when they're done with school, they never finish another book, which is wild to me. Because if you're trying to like learn and better yourself, like reading is a really good approach. I think it's like much better than something like YouTube videos, which I think is like what people think is like a reasonable approach. Not that YouTube videos don't have a place, but it's like they cater to a certain type of, well, obviously this is a YouTube video, so this is like meta to some extent, but like they often cater to certain types of things that are not like the acquisition of knowledge, like being funny, being clickbait, being outrageous, being often like controversial or these types of things. And they also don't, you passively receive the information, right? Unless you're like doing some sort of exercise where you'll watch for a minute and then you'll take notes and then you'll reflect or something like this. If you're not doing something like this, it's very passive. And I think active engagement is important. There was actually this study that was done that showed that students reported learning better in classrooms that were that did a lot of just pure lecture on the part of the teacher. And they reported that they thought they learned better and that they liked it more. They gave the lecturers higher scores. But what the data showed is the classes where the lecturer had a lot of group discussion and group participation, they learned better. So if you're a lecturer and you know about this study, it puts you in this weird spot where in order to be more successful, because the student reviews matter, as far as like you in terms of like that's largely how you get reviewed by the administration. The student reviews are better if you just lecture, pure lecture. But the student outcomes are better if they do like a lot of participatory work. And so it's this thing where, I definitely think like YouTube, like learning stuff on YouTube is like something you could do, but it's not, it shouldn't be the only tool. And I think that I'm not suggesting people try and read 30 books in 30 days, but never reading a book after graduating from school, like whatever your final schooling is, to me is like, it's a little crazy. I'm also thinking, as a final aside, that I'm going to perhaps start doing segments where I just talk about an individual study as well as some implications for this, which is having some notes for that is probably why I just referenced a whole bunch of studies here. So as far as discussion goes, has anyone else tried to do any sort of reading challenge, and what was the challenge, and do they have any types of comments, critiques, anything like this as it relates to reading challenges, and have a good one.